the topic, or actually the facts that we've discussed in the video last week, namely the Russian attack on Ukraine, is very distressing. So distressing that, to be honest, actually for me it's even difficult to watch the news, to keep up with the events. And it's also very difficult for me to look at the comments to the video, so I didn't even follow up with those. Nevertheless, the first 2 or 3 days when the first comments came in, even though many were quite critical of what I said, I was pleased by, let's say, the respectfulness with the tone of most comments. So I think if we can cultivate such a civilized discourse, that's already a lot. And if so, then the channel has already maybe even fulfilled its purpose. I want to address a few issues and respond to a few comments. First one here by Alexander McCall. He writes, "You have some really interesting philosophy videos, but man, stick to your subject." Well, thanks, Alexander. I'll do that. Actually, the concept of the pariah principle is closely related to my idea of moral foolishness. It's basically an idea of amorality that I apply to this present military conflict. In order to discuss it a little more in depth, I want to talk about this piece here I found on CNN just a few days ago. And I actually think this piece on CNN makes a pretty similar argument to what I was saying in the video. So let's read what CNN says. They write, "The morality is black and white here, but diplomacy seldom is. The concessions that come with negotiations are often painful, but our experience has taught us they are infinitely preferable to the indefinite continuation of hostilities, and even when conflicts are driven by an irrational actor like Putin, the logic of diplomacy can take hold." Well, I guess this statement can be summarized briefly by saying we think and communicate in black and white morality, but in order to survive, we actually often need to suspend it. So CNN says the morality is black and white. Well, it is. That's the nature of morality. That's how it functions. It's a way of communicating in the form of good and evil, which means black and white. Now, they say the morality is black and white here referring to the case, the war. However, another reading of the same sentence would be the morality is black and white here, that is on our side. But as a matter of fact, the morality is black and white also there on the other side, right? For Putin too, the morality is black and white. And as a matter of fact, it was black and white for Hitler too. So we have to understand that the pariah also operates in a highly moralistic mode. And for the pariah too, things are black and white. So the pariah is directly enclosed in this dynamic. And that's precisely why, in order to survive, as CNN points out here, morality has to be suspended, and we have to find a way to suspend morality in order to find a way out. Now, going back to the pariah principle, again, it's a communication mechanism relying on morality that somehow fosters or creates a pariah by a self-reinforcing good-evil binary. It's somewhat similar to a famous quote from the Bible, Matthew 12:30, here translation from the King James Bible, "He that is not with me is against me." So this binary dynamic, and that's the point, eventually leaves no room for mediation, right? There is nothing else, nothing other than either being with or against me. Now, in this way, of course, then there is no room for a third party that can mediate, or as I referred to in the last video, as George Beebe, the CIA analyst, said, a party that helps finding a face-saving solution to both sides. And additionally, because of this lack of a third position, the pariah also increasingly gets desperate, unhinged, uninhibited. I want to describe the same dilemma with a few other quotes I found in the news, namely in the South China Morning Post, a Hong Kong newspaper. The South China Morning Post quotes the Ukrainian Foreign Minister Kubila, I'm quoting here, "Ukraine stands ready to strengthen communication with the Chinese side and looks forward to China's mediation in achieving a ceasefire." So that's, again, a call for mediation. Now, we can look at another call for mediation that reflects how the pariah principle somehow obstructs this very call. So this is also from the South China Morning Post, and it's about a European Union call for mediation. Again, I'm quoting here. "The EU is now pushing China to help negotiate a ceasefire," said Nabila Masrali, its foreign affairs spokeswoman. So this sounds like a call for mediation. But then the article goes on, "China is calling for de-escalation and dialogue, but has avoided taking sides," Masrali said. So this is a paradox here, right? If the EU wants China, or anyone else for that matter, now Israel is mediating, fortunately, you cannot call at the same time for the mediator to take sides as a precondition for being a good mediator. The opposite is the case. In order to be a mediator, you have, at least initially, not to take sides. And importantly, the role of the mediator is not to make a moral judgment. It's not the role of the mediator to say, these people are right and these people are wrong, these are good and these are evil. The mediator's function is to find a solution that both sides can live with and that somehow works for both sides. And in order to do this, similar to what CNN said and to what I said in the video, you actually need to suspend the moral discourse for a while. And once you succeed in mediation, then you'll be even able to cooperate in the future, which also is somehow made impossible by the pariah principle, because the pariah principle excludes the willingness to cooperate. So this brings me to another comment by a viewer. Bea Ray writes, "The reason why we're on the brink of a world war is the moralization of geopolitics. The reason why we are on the brink of civil conflict is the moralization of politics. For decades, every single issue has been turned into a moral crusade, which is incredibly useful, powerful in the immediate, but the end result is an inability to compromise." Yes, that's more or less exactly the point I was trying to make. Now, we need to switch from a moralistic mode, from a pariah mode, to a mediation mode as early as possible in order to avoid a conflict getting out of hand. And this is, Alexander, by the way, also a philosophical point that I take from Taoism. Let's look at two quotes from the Laos of the Tao Te Ching. Chapter 59, in my translation, says, "Early accommodation is called multiple accumulation of efficacy." Well, in my interpretation, what this means is basically that early prevention is the most effective way to avoid dysfunctionality. And we can read this quote in conjunction with another quote from chapter 19, which again in my translation roughly says, "Abandon humanity and discard righteousness, and the people will return to filial piety and care." So what this means is basically get rid of an overly moral language and people will be able to live peacefully again. So taken together, these two sayings mean avoid early on getting stuck in the pariah principle. This brings me to an important question that was asked by several viewers, and I'll quote here Donny EDX77. "What's the difference between what you are suggesting and appeasement?" That's very important to clarify. So appeasement means that one side gives in to the demands of the other to appease the other side and thereby end the conflict. The pariah principle basically aims at isolating and discrediting the other side so that it becomes so weak so that there will no longer be a conflict and hopefully the other side just gives in. Now, what I was advocating is a third principle, namely mediation. And in mediation, we need a third, or we rely on a third party to de-escalate a conflict as early as possible. Politically, this means, if I'm allowed to talk once more politically, despite what Alexander said, this means that we should have something like an organization like the United Nations, but one that actually functions. It's pretty obvious that the United Nations were founded after the First World War precisely to be something like a mediation forum. But obviously for various reasons that hasn't happened. I just hope we won't need a third world war in order to achieve a functioning mediation institution. Now, why is the pariah principle so popular? Quite a few viewers also pointed to the reason for that. Well, because it serves all kinds of political systems so well. Obviously, it serves authoritarian systems, right, by pointing toward an external pariah that they defend their people from. Authoritarian regimes can build up legitimacy. But very importantly, it equally works in liberal democracies, right? If you have parties competing in an election, the pariah principle is very useful for giving more legitimacy to your own position. So that's really a problem that no matter in which political system, we see the pariah principle brings strong short-term benefits. So again, to summarize briefly, the pariah principle is some sort of a dialectical conflict dynamics where a distinction between a non-pariah and a pariah can easily escalate and actually create or foster a pariah. Now, secondly, you can see that a pariah principle is at work when all parties in a conflict employ highly morally charged language. This also very clearly kind of represents a shift to profile politics. So now we have this situation that bar owners pour out the Russian vodka and post it on social media in order to basically improve the profile of the bar. Similarly, we have lots of corporations and companies publicly taking a stance regarding the war. It seems there is increasingly not even an option to remain silent. If you're somehow in business, in order to prove the legitimacy even of your business, you have to engage in some form of moral communication in a situation like this. The problem that arises from this is basically that you can no longer distinguish between the moral proclamation and the profiling gesture of an individual or the marketing gesture of a company or a corporation. And the elimination of the distinction between the two, I think, between the moral statement on the one hand and the self-profiling on the other, that there is no longer a distinction possible between the two, is a sign of an intense form of profile politics, which I think is problematic. Let me conclude with a philosophical quote from Gilles Deleuze from his book on Spinoza. Here Deleuze writes, "Morality is the judgment of God, the system of judgment. But ethics overthrows the system of judgment. The opposition of values, good-evil, is supplanted by the qualitative difference of modes of existence, good-bad." So what Deleuze calls, in reference to Spinoza, ethics here, is actually what I call moral foolishness or amorality. This means that, again quoting Deleuze here, the qualitative difference of modes of existence, which actually in Sam Harris' words you can call much more straightforwardly simply considerations of well-being. So when these considerations of well-being are regarded as more important than what Deleuze calls systems of judgment, a good, evil, morality. So the transition towards ethics for Deleuze corresponds to the transition towards well-being in terms of morality by Sam Harris. And for me, it corresponds to the transition towards amorality or moral foolishness. And this simply is supposed to enable people to get along with one another in a productive way. So this actually already serves as an introduction to the next video we're intending to post, which will be a discussion once more on Sam Harris and amorality in response to viewers' comments.